the way it was being framed was if this was back to the two nation theory of Pakistan. Pakistani army chief talking about how Hindus and Muslims can't live together. There is a permanent divide.
Hello and welcome back to The Focus. India and Pakistan have one of the most dangerous rivalries in the world, not just because of history or ideology, but because both are nuclear armed and deeply mistrustful of the other. Since partition in 1947, they fought wars, had skirmishes, and traded blows across a tense and heavily militarized border. Add to that cross-border terrorism, political brinkmanship, and global power interference, and you've got a conflict where even a minor flashpoint could escalate fast. But this isn't just a regional story, it's a global risk. Joining me today to unpack the complexity of this crisis is Professor Harsh V. Pant, one of India's leading strategic thinkers, with appointments at the Observer Research Foundation, King's College London, and Delhi University. Let's dive in. Harsh, welcome to The Focus.
Thanks for having me, John.
Harsh, for those tuning in from outside the region, could you briefly walk us through the latest events that have brought India and Pakistan back to the brink? And in your view, how has the nature of the crisis evolved from past confrontations?
John, as you were mentioning, this is a long history here, and that has continued to color the South Asian landscape. But I think the recent incident, and the recent episode, the crisis has been slightly different from the rest, and it started. As it always tends to do in the Valley of Kashmir to begin with, where a group of terrorists attacked a group of tourists. And I think what shook India particularly this time was that innocent civilians, were reportedly targeted on the basis of religion. And there was a messaging which was going out from the terrorists who did this, and perhaps their backers, that look, the seeming normalcy that was coming to the Kashmir Valley after a very long time, because after all, the tourists were attacked, and these tourists have been coming back to Kashmir in hordes in the last few years, as a degree of normalcy had been returning to the valley. So, I think in some ways this was perhaps also a last roll of the dice for the terrorists and their supporters, the backers back in Pakistan, who thought that, look, if not now, then we may lose this issue forever. And in that sense, it was quite horrific. The way civilians were targeted, they were massacred. Around 26 innocent civilians were killed, and I think that raised the temperature in India to an extent where it became almost impossible not to think of a serious response to this crisis, because India has had a long history of cross-border terrorism, as you were mentioning, in Kashmir in particular. And a lot of the times, if you go back, for example, you mentioned the nuclear issue, 1998 nuclear, in 1998 both India and Pakistan become overt nuclear weapon states. And then a series of crises erupt. There's what is called the Kargil crisis. There is then the attack on Indian Parliament a year later, and then Mumbai terror attacks, very famously, in terms of the television, age. We saw terrorists roaming around in the streets of Mumbai and killing people. So, but the response of India to a lot of these crises had been, look, because we are under the nuclear umbrella, if you will, both India and Pakistan are nuclear states, it is better to absorb the costs of these attacks and not retaliate against Pakistan in ways that perhaps would escalate. And you would climb the escalation ladder. Now, I think what has happened increasingly in recent years is that absorption capacity has given way to a more serious attempt to take the battle, if you will, to Pakistan and to the supporters of terrorism. And therefore, when last month this what is called the massacre in Pahalgam, this is the place where the terrorists attacked the tourists that happened. It created a sense that, look, this is now becoming unsustainable, because this was not simply about Pakistan's establishment, military establishment targeting India for political reasons. The way it was being framed was if this was back to the two nation theory of Pakistan. Pakistani army chief talking about how Hindus and Muslims can't live together. There is a permanent divide. So it almost led to India's response. And of course, Pakistani military counter response, and the crisis escalated quite dramatically.
But of course, Harsh, the whole issue over Kashmir is not just about terrorism. It's also about something much deeper, which affects both countries, and that is access to water and the glacial melt from the Himalayas. Pakistan's concerns obviously are that India holds the whip hand in this. And so, up until, well, basically this last crisis, there's been this Indus Valley Treaty, which survived 3 wars between India and Pakistan. And now Prime Minister Modi has taken that off the table. Where does that put Pakistan? And do we expect this being a sort of almost counter provocation to the Pakistanis? Because it's really affecting them at an existential level now, isn't it?
See, I think certainly, and I think that is something that that perhaps India has not been given enough credit for. That, look, water is often used. I mean, this is an age where almost everything has been weaponized by many countries across the world. Now, but as you were mentioning, despite grave provocations, the Indus Waters Treaty had stood the test of time. That India was not willing to touch it, partly because of all the reasons that you mentioned. That, look, this impacts ordinary Pakistanis, this impacts the agricultural landscape there, this impacts livelihood of many people in Pakistan. And India was reluctant to enter into what are called water wars in the Himalayan ecological environment. It's a very fragile, in any case, ecosystem. So I think, but and in this particular case, what happened is, after and there were a lot of demands to revise it. I think a lot of the specialists, for example, experts in India, had said that, look, uh, the treaty, the way it was framed, when it was framed, was unfair to India, because the distribution of waters was not particularly favorable to India. But also the fact that treaties are also part of a particular time frame. They also should respond to the changing realities. And what you are mentioning, that, look, ecological and environmental issues have changed, and they are evolving very, very rapidly. So how should you respond to that, had been a big part of the conversation. India was unwilling at an official level to touch that for a very long time, till now, as you mentioned. And now what happened, I think, is something, as I was discussing in my in my first answer, that when in the past, in the last few crises in particular, we have had a crisis in 2016, and then in 2019, where again India had responded a bit militarily. But those provocations were targeted at Indian military establishments. One was against the Indian paramilitary base, the other was targeted against an army base. And so India and the Indian official response was also in some ways kinetic, but aimed at military, targeting specific, terror infrastructure, etc. Now, this time, I think there was a demand that, look, the terror groups and the supporters are now looking at expanding the conflict, or rethinking the contours of the conflict in ways that is now targeting ordinary individuals. And this is also interesting, that while the tourists were targeted, of course, and the tourists have come from all over India to Kashmir, but also in some ways the terrorists were targeting the ordinary people of Kashmir Valley, who had an economic link to these tourists. So they were also targeting the livelihoods of these people, and therefore, once the terror attacks happened, perhaps for the first time, we saw an emotional outburst of the kind that we saw in the valley, where ordinary people came out on the streets, and they rallied against Pakistan and the terrorists, because for them this was an attack on their livelihoods. So I think, in that sense, Indian government signaling by keeping the treaty, Indus Waters Treaty, in abeyance was that, look, if this is going to target our civilians, for a long time India had been holding this back. We will go back and target, the civilians. We will not hesitate in targeting the civilians, if at all that can raise the costs for Pakistan. And I think, unfortunately, what happened was that, look, if this was happening, and if you were looking at it from a more rational cost benefit calculus way, you would, from a Pakistani perspective, you would look at the costs and you would say that, look, this has risen to us to a certain extent where it is escalating. Now, instead of that, that move by India was not taken very seriously by Pakistan, and nothing happened after that. So I think it was a way for India to start building pressure on Pakistan. But when the response didn't come, you saw a rapid escalation at the kinetic level happening. So I think the first phase of reaction from India was non-kinetic. It was about Indus Waters Treaty signaling that we are keeping it in abeyance. It was about trade bans. It was about visa restrictions, etc. Now, when that did not result in anything substantive, India took the military and kinetic action as a second phase of its response.
So, is this all part of what you had mentioned in a recent article you wrote, calibrated escalation? And if it is, do you think that this sort of strategic posture by India is sustainable? Because we've come from a time where India was, as you rightly pointed out earlier, especially with regard to the aftermath of the 2008 Mumbai attack, I think it was Prime Minister Singh relied on strategic restraint. So, how has this changed the game?
I think, in a sense, John, the onus for a very long time, and given the circumstances of South Asia, and given the nuclear realities in South Asia, it was believed, perhaps by certain actors in Pakistan, particularly the Pakistani military, and the way they tend to use terrorism as an instrument of state policy, is that, look, we will continue to operate below the nuclear threshold. We will continue to provoke India, and India would have no option but to absorb these costs because of the threat of nuclear escalation. So it became a paradox, right? That nuclear weapons are, in the strategic literature, they are said to provide a strategic balance, that nuclear weapons deter nuclear weapons. So you will not have direct conflicts. But below the threshold of nuclear weapons, you can do several things. You can provoke, you can use terrorism, you can do some skirmishes on the border, you can keep raising the temperature, hoping the other side will have no option but to absorb these costs. And I think in that context, and given that India is a bigger economy, India is increasingly a rising economic power, and wants to focus on development as its priority in terms of foreign policy and developmental policy. And that is the basic marker of India's approach to global affairs. Uh, it became, I think, after a point, almost unsustainable politically also for Indian policymakers, that how do you convince a population of 1.4 billion people that, look, we just have to continue to absorb these costs. We continue to
Right.
have people killed on the streets. We continue to have these kind of demonstrations of non-state, because there was always a plausible deniability. Pakistan would never accept that they are behind any of these attacks. And so you would have these groups of terrorists come and attack Indians in the streets, in key areas. And I think beyond a point, it almost people wanted an answer from. I mean, India is a democracy, and policymakers need to answer to their electorate. Now, I think since last decade, and after I think Prime Minister Modi came to power, there has been an attempt to respond to some of these provocations. And as you were mentioning, in 2016 there was an attack where India takes the battle slightly into the Pakistani territory, but it's a caliber, it's a small scale response. Then again, in 2019, there is what is the Pathankot and Balakot, that the Pathankot base is attacked in India. India responds through an aerial strike into Pakistan. And but they are limited in nature. They are, they happen within a few hours. They are wrapped up. This time, I think India not only decided that it would escalate, but it would keep on climbing the escalation ladder. From the very beginning, what India said, that the onus of de-escalation will be on Pakistan. If they want us to escalate, we are willing to climb up the escalation ladder. Now, it's a dangerous strategy. It's a dangerous,
Oh, yeah.
it's a risky move, as you were pointing out earlier. That look, where do we go from here? But I think the calculation was that look, we have lived under this bogey of nuclear umbrella for a very long time, because every time the crisis would happen, or every time, even the the moment terror attacks would happen in India, Pakistan would go out and say that look, this is we are a nuclear region, and therefore they would want to attract global attention, and rightfully so. International community would say, look, this is getting very dangerous, very risky. So why don't you cool down? No, but the cooling down meant that all the costs would have to be absorbed by India only. The other
Mm.
side got scot free. I think this time the calculus changed. India used a set of issues, as I said, first phase non-kinetic, and the second phase kinetic action, and made it very clear that look, it is for Pakistan to decide how to whether they want to de-escalate and how they want to de-escalate. And so I think the onus shifted, and I think this is in some ways the new normal that South Asia will have to live with now.
Well, it's not just South Asia, it's the rest of the world. And, we know in the outside of the subcontinent, we know very little about the detail that drives this conflict forward. So there is this abiding fear that, when we look at Pakistan and India going for it in their customary fashion, it becomes a major concern, not just because they're going for it and it's, two nuclear powers going for it, but we really don't understand fully the things that drive this conflict moving forward. But speaking of the conflict and the nature of the conflict, you touched on a number of issues which I really want to get into the weeds with. First and foremost, deterrence. How does a nuclear armed adversary like Pakistan get deterred when it uses non state actors maintaining plausible deniability? In normal international discourse, a power, if it wants to do something to another power, their poor prince are usually all over it. They want to claim moral victory of some sort, so they don't mind actually standing in the light if they think that the cause is justified. But Pakistan is a very difficult, or represents a difficult category of country where it knows that once the nuclear card is played, that's it. So again, as you rightly point out, there's that sub-nuclear level where they use the non-state actors to achieve whatever ends they need to achieve. But it's complicated by the fact that there are also non-state actors within Kashmir and other parts of Pakistan, that also have, one would consider, legitimate reasons to rise up against local authorities, which then makes it even murkier. You really can't finger one side or the other for doing whatever, because there is the Pakistani side, there's the Indian side, then there are the local sides. How does one go through all of that and come out of it unscathed?
Yes, and John, I think that's why sometimes many in India feel that there is a lack of appreciation of the challenges that India faces in its neighborhood, because this is a very difficult neighborhood.
Mm,
It's like, as you are mentioning, the way Pakistan can operate and has operated makes it very difficult for India to make a convincing case to anyone. Now, look,
mm,
uh, for for decades now, India has been facing the terror problem.
yep.
And as we are discussing it right now, 76 years after independence, uh, we are still struggling to figure out how do to make sense of all this, right?
Mm, mm,
And then, as you say, outsiders find it very difficult to come to terms, grapple with what is the challenge. You can imagine the challenge on on Indian policymakers who have to
mm.
respond to this day in and day out. And I think in some ways, uh, there are two aspects to this. One uh, is that, look, I think Pakistan as an actor, Pakistan, as a sponsor of terrorism, this story is no longer only India's story. After all, Osama bin Laden was found in Pakistan, and Abbottabad, right? So this
Yeah.
is now
Yeah.
it is now an old story that Pakistan and Pakistanis themselves have accepted it. As recently, when this crisis started, the senior leadership in Pakistan said, "Oh, we were asked to do so many things when Americans were fighting the Soviet Union, and therefore we had to use terrorism and use actors like and rogue actors to help us." So they have accepted it in their own ways, and in many ways that they have been culpable and of course evidence. There is it's no longer that it's only India's story. It's a global story. There is a reason why it is called the global epicenter of terrorism, or in that sense. I mean, you just have to look at the history. So the challenge, of course, is as much the challenge is as much India's as it is perhaps of the international communities. That how do you make such a state, how do you normalize such a state, how do you make that state like Pakistan think differently about its future, about the possibilities that exist? And unfortunately what has happened is that at times short term solutions lead to long term problems. That every time there is a crisis in Pakistan, for example, economic crisis, for good reasons, for genuine reasons, countries come together and they say, "All right, let's bail Pakistan out." Now, what it means is that it creates negative incentives on the part of Pakistani leaders, on the Pakistani establishment to do things. Now, for the last so many years, one thing that has categorically stood out is that military tends to be the central player in Pakistan. Now, everyone has tried everything. I mean, Americans have been the best of friends with Pakistanis. They have not been able to change their behavior. And military tends to dominate in ways that it does. And despite all this, today you see China, for example, becoming the most important partner of Pakistan in so many ways.
Yep.
And therefore, for India, the challenge becomes of China, Pakistan joining hands against India. So that's one set of issues, which is about Pakistan internal structures, Pakistan internal vulnerabilities, the inability of Pakistan to get grips on governance issues, basic governance. There are challenges that Pakistan today is facing in areas like Baluchistan, where there is an independence movement going on. There is a challenge they are facing in their border with Afghanistan. Of all the countries, you have the Taliban in Afghanistan challenging Pakistan. So there are multifarious issues at a time when Pakistan is going bust economically. So in a sense, the idea that you can keep on provoking a country like India that is so many times your size, that is, where there is no comparison economically, but that is the mindset, that is the DNA, which was ingrained at the time of independence, and that continues in so many ways. And that means that a lot of the actions they would do will be ideologically driven rather than looking at the cost benefit calculus more rationally. So that's one set of issues. The other, as you said, is that look, in Kashmir, there has been challenges from the beginning. India has faced that. There are internal issues in Kashmir. Now, I think what has happened in Kashmir, John, is that in some ways the story of Kashmir has been turning positive in the last few years as far as India is concerned. So when you see today the economic integration of Kashmir with mainland India, that means that you are looking at how the older paradigm of looking at Kashmir as a problem part of India is slightly beginning to disperse, and that means that in a sense, while there are still areas, regions, and organizations that believe in a certain kind of idea of Kashmir, and they're not happy with what perhaps New Delhi is trying to do there. But by and large, you see a movement for the better, and therefore, when you see this integration tourism coming in, you look at with all the challenges. It's not that the Kashmir issue had become completely marginal, but two things had happened. One, the Kashmiris themselves realized that their future with India is much more something to look forward to. Why would you go to or why would you take sustenance from a state that is like Pakistan, which is beginning to face problems itself? So rather than a country that like India, that is making its own way forward in the world. So I think that perception shifted. And with that perception, you are seeing gradual changes in the ground. You are seeing better infrastructure. You are seeing better linkages with other parts of India. You are seeing a sense of belonging to India, which is quite strikingly different on the ground. And therefore, the reaction to this crisis was very different this time. But also the fact that I think globally, uh, this whole idea, the narrative that Pakistan had been trying to sell for a very long time, that look, this is simply a question of um, India's um, actions in Kashmir, that is the problem, or that India's response to India treats Kashmiri people differently. That's the problem. That narrative had begun to undercut itself, because Pakistan itself was a problem. If you are looking at your own internal challenges, you are not able to manage your own people. Your claim to other issues goes down, but also because India's handling of Kashmir became more mature, became more sensitive to regional aspirations, to local aspirations, and I think that shift perhaps also has also allowed the rest of the world to look at the problem differently. So if you look at, for example, what how the world reacts to the Kashmir issue today, which has almost become a non-issue. I mean, at one point in time, this was the biggest roadblock in India-US relationship. US
Mm.
would try to come to and argue on Kashmir, and India would say, no, this is a bilateral matter. We will deal it with it on our own. That issue has largely been relegated to the sidelines. India and the US, India and the West, India and other parts of the world, they engage on a different set of issues today. There's Indo-Pacific, there is the
Yeah.
rise of China, India's economic power, India's own economic ties with large parts of the world. So the issues have changed. And I think that's also the reason, perhaps, as I mentioned early on, that for many in Pakistani military establishment, this is a moment of worry, because they have defined their legacy, their centrality in Pakistani polity, their role as the guarantor of Pakistani security in terms of what they can do for vis-a-vis India in Kashmir. And I think if that narrative is falling apart, then greater space or thinking has to go into areas where you can circumvent it, or you can somehow mitigate that problem by putting in other issues, by bringing in terrorism back to the table, by bringing the you know the nature the Kashmir issue back on the table. And I think in some ways this is the outcome of the recent crisis. If you look at some of the reactions in Pakistan, they perhaps feel that they have succeeded in once again bringing global attention to the Kashmir issue, and that is perhaps they think that that's what they have achieved out of this conflict. Now, how far this is true, we don't know, and would only know in the future. But you know, the centrality of this idea that look, we will continue to bring this issue to the table because no one has been listening for so long, and we have now succeeded in doing that. So I think there are multiple dimensions of how both within India and how Pakistan is to be looked at, that is linked to the wider world. And I think in some ways the loss of traction of the Kashmir issue in the global discourse also means that there is more pressure now on Pakistani military to continue to bring this issue to the table. And I think that's why it's also difficult to see if everything will be hunky dory going forward, if things would completely settle down, because there is no real incentive on the part of Pakistan to let go of this issue.
So, really, just listening to what you say, the first thought crosses my mind, and that is, well, can we see some parallels between an isolated or semi-isolated Pakistan on the one side and a completely isolated North Korea on the other? I mean, there is the danger, of course, that Pakistan just completely goes into itself and becomes a hermit kingdom, just as the North Koreans have done. And the only way that they're ever going to get the international spotlight shone on them is by stirring up trouble with India, conducting nuclear tests, doing whatever the North Koreans have been doing, because that's really the only card that they put on the table every time they feel as though people are just ignoring them and they're moving on to other things, arguably other more positive things. So, what do you say about the potential to isolate Pakistan and what that may do for the subcontinent generally in terms of stable relations?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. I think India's I think approach to a number of these questions over the last few years has been that given uh, Pakistan's you know centrality in the in what India calls global network of terrorism, it is important to for the international community to call out Pakistan's behavior when it comes to terrorism and export of terror ideology. And you look at, I mean, if you look at a number of, a large number of episodes around the world, you do see an imprint of Pakistan in a number of, not only in India, but across the world. So there is an element of how the inability of Pakistan to govern itself has had to govern itself well has had consequences for the larger world at large, and this use of terrorism as an instrument of state policy almost became becoming a central marker of Pakistani behavior. But I also think that in some ways uh, Pakistan's elites uh, are very global in their approach, in the sense that they have they're very well off. And the military, Pakistani military, for example, they run commercial enterprises in the country. They are not simply a fighting machine. And in that sense, their linkages, their children study abroad, they are settled abroad. So the network that Pakistani elites, both political and military elites, have across the world would require a lot more to get them converted into a North Korean style Muhammad kingdom. They have stakes in how the world perceives them. They have stakes in how the world looks at them and engages them. So I don't think they are suddenly I mean, I think they'll be worried, and therefore they are worried when when the world targets them and sanctions them. There is the sense and also I think what perhaps gets less attention is ultimately a lot of the troubles that Pakistan is facing has to do with Pakistan's own internal governance dysfunctionalities. That ultimately the centrality of military will have to be, it had to be countered. Because unless we do that, and unless we allow a civilian, leadership to emerge, which is strong in its own right, not dependent on the military. Now, if you look at today's you know, civilian government in Pakistan. It is one of the weakest governments Pakistan has had. It is completely reliant on the military. It is completely reliant on the benevolence of the army chief, and therefore they have no incentive in looking at the world differently, in creating new ways of thinking, in responding to the aspirations of ordinary Pakistanis, because the aspiration is linked to the military, and the military's primary aspiration is to keep control over the Pakistani narrative, to keep its centrality preserved in the Pakistani socio-political apparatus, and that means that the calculus is very different. So I think there is I think Pakistan will continue and will continue to engage the world. They know that, I mean, they have engaged China, for example, very substantially. They've tried to, and China has given them a lot of military and economic aid. Because what also happened, and I think you mentioned this in the early part of your when you started off in your comments, that the global politics has moved on. During the Cold War, Pakistan was central to the way the US in particular was managing this part of the world. And post Cold War, and particularly in the last few years and decades, the US China contestation becoming the central pivot of global politics, Indo Pacific emerging as the central theater of global politics, means that India's centrality inevitably will be looked at through a very different light, which means that Pakistan's marginalization will also become automatic. That, look, it is not so important anymore, and if it continues to be a problem state, then what is the point of investing in Pakistan? And once America, you had the famous Osama bin Laden being found in Pakistan, and then you had the whole Afghanistan, adventure going belly up for the Americans, and so Americans moving away from Afghanistan, which meant that even the last vestige of dependence that Americans had on Pakistan was is not there anymore. So Pakistan now basically has to go and beg for money every time there is a crisis in which they require support from the US. Otherwise, US has no real utility for Pakistan, and that is the way. In some ways, the larger strategic realities have been, emerging, and therefore Pakistan's reliance on China has been continuously growing. And because China-India relationship has been in disarray, we have also seen the combination of China-Pakistan relationship becoming a central factor. So, in that sense, I think even in India's foreign policy, we have seen a marginalization of Pakistan. India's foreign policy today talks much more about China, Indo-Pacific, what is happening to the larger balance of power than it talks about Pakistan. I mean, this was very different, say, a few decades back, where almost everything about Indian foreign policy would be about Pakistan. Today, it is hardly about Pakistan. And I think that is also, in some ways, must be chafing at Pakistan, the military leadership, that look, this is completely different now, that we are no longer even in the same category with that at one point we were talked about. So the larger landscape is changing. And I think that also means that their push, to keep, at least to look on the surface, as an equal to India, that they would continue to buy weapons even when they are not, they can't support it financially. They will continue to get, there'll be debt. You'll be indebted, but you'll continue to you'll continue to build a large network of military industrial capacity, and you will build relations with countries that perhaps are not very favorably inclined towards India. So I do think that uh, you know that ability, or that desire to continue to be on par with India somehow, that will continue to drive Pakistani military's approach to a number of these questions, and that would inherently be problematic, given how the resource base of the two countries is and will continue to be for some time at least.
You're listening to The Focus. I'm John Bruni, your host, and we're speaking with Professor Harshavi Pant, one of India's leading strategic thinkers, as we unpack the latest India-Pakistan crisis and what it means for regional stability and global diplomacy. Harsh, I'm just wondering now about this other, dare I say, elephant in the room, and that is Pakistan is a majority Muslim country. India has about 15% of its population, roughly about 220 million Muslims within its own borders. And it's run by the BJP, which is a majoritarian Hindu party. This is another layer of complexity, which I think a lot of the Western media don't really pay that much attention to because it's just so complicated. Can you walk us through what the Muslim community within India means for Islamabad? Do they have these sort of ties to stir up trouble within India's borders using Indian Muslims? And if so, does the arrival of Prime Minister Modi on the scene, towing more of a hardline Hindu nationalist philosophy, bode for even more instability into the future? Because you've got one side doing one thing, the other side doing the exact opposite. It doesn't look like it's a good match for peace and stability moving forward, right?
See, John, I would say that, look, to answer this question, you just have to look at, Mr. Modi came to office in 2014, and uh, so you have to assess what happened since 2014 in India, Pakistan, to what happened before. So if you look at the evidence is pretty clear that Pakistanis have been sustained in their approach towards India, irrespective of who is in power in Delhi. So they have not, it's not as if Mr. Modi's arrival had, it changed Pakistani behavior in any way. It is, I think, India's approach to Pakistan changed certainly, and I think it is also very interesting that in his initial years, um, Prime Minister Modi made a striking outreach to Pakistani leadership. So first 2 years, India Prime Minister Modi was reaching out to Pakistani civilian leadership. Nawaz Sharif was in power, and he, then Prime Minister of Pakistan, he was invited to Mr. Modi's swearing-in ceremony in 2014. He was here in Delhi. And then, of course, Mr. Modi has been, he went on an unannounced visit to Pakistan. So there has been an attempt by all prime ministers, including Prime Minister Modi, to somehow come to a consensus with Pakistan on how do you manage your bilateral relationship without it becoming into a conflictual relationship. Without it has not been uh, that attempts have not been made. Attempts have been made consistently. There have been a lot of agreements and treaties that surround, that build the relationship architecture. So even so, what I'm trying to say is that I don't think domestic politics in India has as much of an impact on what Pakistan does or does not do. I think they use now increasingly the bogey of Mr. Modi being in power and Mr. Modi being a challenge. You just have to ask the question: were they any different when Mr. Modi was not in power? And of course, there, we have talked about episodes, including the Mumbai episode, when there was a different
Mm.
party in power in India.
Yep.
And
Yep.
what is also interesting is that Indian Muslims have always stood up for India whenever there has been a crisis. And so, while you are right that there is, there might be an attempt that Pakistanis will continue to make, because, of course, you try to use all kinds of networks to ensure that there is domestic instability. But look at the response of Muslims from India, and this is again a consistent theme in Indian Muslims response, right? From partition, a lot of the Muslims decided not to go back to Pakistan because they felt that India was their homeland, and they have continued to live with this idea that they want to live in a secular, forward-looking India. They don't want to live in a theological Islamic country like Pakistan. Now, Pakistanis make a big deal that look, we are the land of the pure, we are the land of it's all, but they have not been able to attract the subcontinental Muslims. If that were the case, Bangladesh would not have been born. So
Mm.
Bangladesh, it's an Islamic country born out of what perhaps happened, what happened within Pakistan to a group of Bengali Muslims, and therefore you had the emergence of Bangladesh. So I think again, Muslims in India, like every time else, this time also came out strongly with, and as we were discussing, even people in Kashmir Valley came out against Pakistan, what they did Pakistan this time, what Pakistan backed terrorists did this time. So I think that narrative that look, this is about Hindus and Muslims, and I think Pakistani military has made this fundamental error in judgment, and I
Mm.
think that's what is costing them. They have not learned from their past behavior. They keep on going back to history. This time, and I think a lot of the people in the subcontinent today trace the origin of the latest conflict to the views of the Pakistani army chief Asim Munir, who in a series of speeches has talked about the two nation theory, which led to the partition of India. He has talked about Hindu civilization versus Muslim civilization, very different. We can't live with each other, and so on and so forth. So he's made a set of articulations publicly to make a case that look, Islam has and Hinduism have cannot survive together. Now that of course blatantly false, because India is a living example that is happening day in and day out, and several other countries in the world. But in a sense, by laying an argument like this, he continues to make a case for a long-term struggle between India and Pakistan, because he's not interested in laying it to rest. He's interested in stirring up emotions that continue to provide him with all the support that is needed, so that he can wage this war against India through proxies, through other instrumentalities that are available to him. And that is again very problematic, because it means fundamentally that if you believe that there is a theological argument to be made about India and Pakistan, then what is the political solution we are seeking? There won't be any political solution ever, because if this is about Hindus and Muslims and civilizational challenges that the countries face, then there is very limited space to maneuver for both political leaderships. And I think that's a very, very dangerous argument, but that he has come back to it publicly now. Of course, it was always there. That's why Pakistan was created. But to come back, to resurrect it the way he has done, to give it not only fuels this sense of certain extremist groups that they will continue to wage this jihadist war against India, but it also continues to sustain the centrality of the military within the system.
Mm.
That only the
Yep.
military is the guarantor of Islamic civilization, and therefore the military should be given greater strength. And he did this at a time when Pakistani military's own role had been questioned by Pakistanis themselves. Their credibility was going down all across because of their inability to manage, and because of the Imran Khan factor. The
Yeah.
Imran Khan, a very popular leader, was put behind the bars by the military, and that led to the credibility of the military going down. And of course, economically, Pakistan is not doing well. Border areas are burning. So in a sense, there is an all-round crisis. So what does he do? Instead of looking at the governance issues, he comes back to the India factor, and he raises the pressure on the India question, and it leads to a set of consequences. Now the question is whether he or the establishment would learn from it, would take a cue and look at some kind of a political resolution, engaging with India, or will this trajectory continue? I mean, given the whatever I have observed over the last 7, 8 decades, I don't think. I mean, I'm very pessimistic that we are going to see a change, in that approach, and therefore, I think the wider questions in South Asia will continue to be this way. And as you said, for the international community, it will continue to be a source of concern and a problem region which somehow will elude any reasonable solution.
Harsh, final two questions, if you don't mind. First one, with the US mediating the recent ceasefire between India and Pakistan, how do external factors influence the dynamics of South Asian security? And what implications does this have for India's policy of strategic autonomy?
See, I think external factors, John, have always influenced this issue, and we have been talking about a number of them through the course of today's discussion.
Yeah.
We have had the US playing an important role, China playing an important role, and of course, the wider international community having a say, of course, as this tends to happen in other crisis regions. Now, and as we were discussing, the Cold War equations were very different.
Mm.
And post Cold War equations as they are emerging now are very different.
Yeah.
With China publicly taking Pakistan's side, and US much more aligned with wider Indian interests. Now, at this point in time, there is a very interesting debate going on in India about, because Mr. Trump was the first one to take credit for the ceasefire.
Hmm.
And then came the Indian response and then the Pakistani response, and which was India's Indian official statement doesn't talk of a ceasefire. It says of a bilateral understanding between India and Pakistan. Now, of course, Mr. Trump has been going up and about saying that, look, my administration did this. I've been able to make peace in this crisis, and I'm going to trade with these countries and going to make. So, and there is a concern in certain sections in India that this desire by Mr. Trump to take credit may also lead to once again American policy hyphenating India and Pakistan. I think one of the most remarkable achievements of Indian foreign policy over the last few years is dehyphenating, India and Pakistan story. That India is a global power now, looking, fastest growing major economy in the world, central to the Indo-Pacific discourse, partnerships with major powers trying to deliver global outcomes. Pakistan, a regional problem which has to be looked at through that lens. So the divergences in the trajectories have been quite significant, and that's how countries around the world have responded to both of these countries. Now, I think some are in India are concerned that Mr. Trump may now say that, look, I want to bring India and Pakistan together. For India, that is a big red line. India doesn't want. India wants this to be a bilateral engagement. India wants this to be resolved bilaterally with Pakistan. And I don't think, and I think that's the larger assessment in the world has been that, look, this will ultimately for India and Pakistan to manage and resolve. Of course, the other countries will express their concern and come and try to help whatever is needed. But ultimately, this is for the two nations to figure out the way forward. Now, that I think in some ways may overshadow what the India-US relationship for at least some time. This talk of American involvement. My own sense is that this is just Mr. Trump being Mr. Trump. He's being over enthusiastic. He was over enthusiastic. He was just trying to take credit for something that that he thought his administration has delivered. Because the realities are quite different on the ground. what really happened in terms of the ceasefire was India's, as we were discussing, India said that, look, the onus of de-escalation is on Pakistan. And then once India signaled its ability to deliver force in areas very close to Pakistan's center of gravity, whether it was Rawalpindi, the military headquarters, whether it was Islamabad, and whether it was some of the nuclear areas, installations. India delivered its air power very close to those installations,
Yeah.
signaling that that Indian military can take on these installations as well, but we are deciding not to. So please, de-escalate. And after that, the local level negotiations started. So India's approach had always been that negotiations for ceasefire should come from the local security actors, like the Director General of Military Operations, who are there at the border, who relate to each other. So Pakistani DGMO called Indian side, Director General of Military Operations called the Indian side, and that's how ceasefire was set up. So, of course, Americans and several other countries were playing back channels. They were taking messages from one side to the other. But I don't think there is any evidence to suggest that they were the ones that brokered the ceasefire. So, Mr. Trump taking the credit may have some implications for how Mr. Trump feels about this conflict. And of course, India is negotiating a bilateral trade agreement with the US at this point, like many other countries. And I think that will also have an impact on the trade trajectory as well. So I think this will be an interesting space to watch out as to how India and the US relate to each other post this crisis. But certainly, I think India's approach to this has been, and I think Prime Minister Modi has spoken about it, and Indian Foreign Ministry has spoken about it, that we are looking at it as primarily a bilateral matter, which India has given a message to Pakistan. Now it is for Pakistan to decide what kind of a relationship it wants to have.
Okay, well, final question. Considering the many heated public debates and panel discussions on the recent crisis that often feature strong opinions and sometimes misinformation, and here I have to say, Piers Morgan Uncensored, I'm watching you. What impact do you think these have on diplomatic efforts and public sentiment in both India and Pakistan?
Oh, I think that's one of the one of the most serious aspects of all conflicts in the world today is the way media and all the spaces in the media have become these platforms for relaying misinformation,
Mm,
because it's, I think, for people to assess both the causes and what is happening, operational realities in real time. It becomes difficult to sift wheat from chaff if
yeah.
the way things are being peddled by in the digital space, as well as in the electronic space, increasingly. And as you said, I think the way this was presented, the way this was articulated, the way I think various actors were also playing their game. So it was not, it was of course certain key media houses doing their bit, but also certain governments using their national broadcasters to amplify misinformation, which has been a big problem in this conflict, but as in other conflicts in recent years. And my guess is that this is only likely to get worse before it gets any better, because I do not see any concerted attempt being made to rein this in. And I think the challenge now is onus is on all of us to do our bit in terms of cleaning the system up. But I guess it will take time. But the challenge, as you mentioned, this conflict, we saw a number of false claims, a number of misinformation pieces being peddled out, and given that the escalation was so quick, it
Mm,
was almost in a few hours we saw the use of all kinds of air power, and then the threat of almost very coming very close to a serious conflict. I don't think the media space played a positive role in shaping the landscape. But as they say, the battles are now being fought as much in the battlefield as it is in the and as it is being done in the cognitive space. So the cognitive space, the perception battle, the narrative war, whatever you want to call it, will has always been. But I think with the availability of technology has almost become central to the way we shape uh, you know the battle space. And I think given as we have mentioned through this discussion, given the challenges and the intricacies of this conflict, it becomes particularly difficult to manage a conflict in real time if from the outside in you continue to use information the way it has been used this time.
Abused, you mean? But yes, I take your point.
Yes.
Harsh, thank you for sharing your insights on the focus.
Thank you, John. Thank you for having me.
From New Delhi, India, that was Professor Harsh V. Pant. Thank you for joining me, John Bruni, for today's episode with Harsh V. Pant. Check out the links in our show notes to learn more about Harsh and to connect with him on social media. Now, on to questions for the audience. Do you believe partition was an inevitable outcome of British colonial policy or a historical error that continues to haunt the subcontinent? Should international powers like the US or China have a role in de escalating India Pakistan tensions? Or does this undermine regional sovereignty and long term stability? If Pakistan's terrorism problem destabilizes peace, does India's rising majoritarian politics pose a comparable internal risk to its democracy and regional strategic posture? Let us know in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's a free way to support us. You can also subscribe to the podcast on the Auscast Network, iTunes, and Spotify, where we'd appreciate your 5-star reviews. Do you have comments or questions about the podcast? Post them in the comments section on YouTube, and I'll do my best to respond to as many as I can. My thanks as ever to the producer of The Focus, Neil Smart. Please stay connected with us on social media. Follow me on X at BruniDoctor and follow The Focus on X at TheFocus_Sage. And don't forget Blue Sky on thefocuspodadl.bsky.social. From Adelaide, South Australia, you've been listening to The Focus.